Welcome to Following, a weekly podcast where we will discuss how to follow Jesus. Christianity is not an event you attend, it's a life you live. Join us each week as we dive into the intersection of real-life circumstances and the life-changing Word of God. Come, follow Jesus with us. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Following. We've got sort of a special episode for you this morning. We're taking a break from the Gospel of John. This past Sunday was our communion week, so there wasn't a full-on sermon in John. So instead, we reached out and asked you all to send in questions, and the question we're going to be looking at this week is, it seems many people are repelled by Christians pushing our beliefs onto others through self-righteous judgment and insisting our values are put into laws for all. So how can we be less abrasive?
It's a great question. And I think, honestly, if there's a lot of questions, maybe 4 or 5 questions here that we have to look at kind of individually to answer the big question that they're asking. So,
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to be unpacked with this one question. There's a lot to talk about. This idea of self-righteous judgment, this idea of Christians in the political arena, is that something that we should pursue? So we're going to hopefully get into that and hopefully answer this question the best we can. So before we answer the question, how can we be less abrasive, let's get into, is it even a legitimate thing to try to convince anyone about our beliefs?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. The reality of it is a lot of times our culture has become very divisive, and it's no longer possible to have a meaningful conversation where you disagree with someone about a particular issue. It becomes almost war, and it is the objective is conquest. The objective is to take them down, take their argument down, and prove to everybody watching that you are the superior intellect, that your position is right, and that they are worthless. And I think that's tragic. You stop learning if you live in the echo chamber of only your own desires. If you're never allowed, if no one can ever push back on what you think is right or true or real, then you're never forced to think through your position. Why do I believe what I believe? And I think whether you're a Christian or an atheist or a secularist or a materialist, whatever philosophical worldview you operate out of, you ought to be able to answer questions about why you believe what you believe. I mean, even the Bible tells us as Christians to be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you. I think he says that in First Peter. Yeah. So this idea that it's wrong to try and convince someone of our beliefs is a charge oftentimes leveled at Christians, and sometimes because Christians can be real jerks in the way they communicate things.
Yeah,
and I think the spirit of this question, there seems to be that they've run into some of these kind of self-righteous, indignant, arrogant people who have a Christian perspective on something, and so it is repellent, it is abrasive, it is annoying and frustrating, and so that you think, well, you should just keep your religious ideas, you should just keep your religious values to yourself. The public square is for facts, but religious ideas are not limited to Christians. Everybody's operating out of a religious idea. We just have different gods, and different things that we pledge our allegiance to, different things that we submit to as right and wrong, and different authorities that we would submit to as right and wrong. For some of us, his name is Jesus, and others of us, it is the self, or it is a scientific naturalism, materialism. So you have to stop and consider, Christians are not the only ones who are trying to promote their worldview in the public square. For instance, in the sexual revolution that we've experienced over the last 20 years, this is what the people who are more open to sexual ethic that's different than a Christian sexual ethic. A Christian sexual ethic is one man, one woman married for life. But that has been pushed against and pushed against and pushed against by the people in our culture. Was it right for them to do that? Did they have a right to say, this is our value, this is our perspective, this is our opinion about what is right, and this is how we would like the law to be read? This law is hurtful for us or whatever. Did they have a right to do that? Well, yeah, they had a right to do that. We live in a free society where you can speak your mind and you can enter into the public debate and say, this is what I think and this is why I think that. They have the right, and they've been doing that. But Christians have the right to speak into that as well and say, well, this is what we believe and this is why we believe it. And so when you come into the public debate about about issues of morality and issues of ethics and issues of right and wrong, in a society, there's going to be laws formed. And in our society, it's going to be the majority value system that is encapsulated in the laws. When our country was founded, it was founded upon Judeo-Christian values. Our country is no longer a majority of Judeo-Christian value people. They're much more secularized. So that and that's going to be reflected in our laws. And I think and that's what's happened. But that doesn't mean it's illegitimate for people in the minority view, whichever minority view that is at the time in history it is, to speak their. That's why our founders provided for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. You have the freedom to worship God, to worship a God according to your own conscience without persecution by the state. And limiting religious expression or religious values to just the Christians and they need to be quiet because that's just a matter of personal opinion. That's not a legitimate position because everyone's operating from a religious worldview. You value something as the highest good and you pursue that with your life. That's your God, whether you call it a God or not. And everyone has the right to speak into the public square. Does that mean that that your opinion will carry the day? Not always, but that's what's so bad about a culture that becomes so divisive and so hate-filled is that you can no longer communicate. You can no longer learn from each other. We need to be civil. And Christians should lead the way in being kind, gracious people. Yeah. And oftentimes, sadly, tragically, that's not the case.
Yeah. So, just a kind of a follow-up question on that one. Should we do this? The question was, is it legitimate? And I think your answer is yes, it is legitimate. But should we, as Christians, enter into this political arena, like as our mission, if you will?
Yes. But our highest objective is not to redeem a culture.
Yeah.
Our highest objective is to make disciples.
Yeah.
And when you read the New Testament, it's really clear. Jesus said we're going to be persecuted and we're going to suffer and we're going to be rejected and we're going to be misunderstood and we're going to be cast out. So you should not be surprised when the majority of the culture doesn't like you, because they didn't like Jesus. And but is it right to speak into the culture to try and bring about a Christian worldview reflected in our laws? Yes, it's right to do that.
Especially when the laws that are being created are harming people.
Yes.
Like I think about abortion laws.
Yeah.
It's absolutely good and right to push against stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. But we have to remember at the end of the day, we may, if we do not carry, if people do not go along with what we're saying as true and they go the opposite way, we haven't lost in the sense, because our primary objective is to help people see Jesus, help people to follow Jesus. As people follow Jesus, their values will begin to align with Jesus. And as more and more people come to faith in Christ, more and more of that shift will begin to occur. I think sometimes we're trying to produce the fruit on the tree before the root of the tree is changed in nature.
Yeah.
A tree, an apple tree is apple by nature. Thus, what comes out of the tree in fruit is apples. And if our culture is primarily producing oranges, you can't. I was reading a book the other day talking about this very thing, and he said you could go and staple apples onto the tree. It doesn't make it an apple tree, and those apples will eventually just rot off. You can change the external behavior for a little bit, but unless the heart's changed and people always do what they want to do, and if their heart is not transformed by Christ, they're going to continue following the desires of self, to do what they see as best in the moment. And it's always going to be different from everybody around them. So should we try to influence the culture? Yes, but that's not our main objective.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah, and so one of the things that this question is getting at is this. I think a lot of Christians on mainstream platforms of media come off as really abrasive and really self-righteous, and it's like, if you don't do this, then you're wrong, and this is the only way to think, and it's very hateful and divisive. So is there a point to be made about self-righteous judgment, or how do we express our opinions or our beliefs without being self-righteous?
Yeah, self-righteous judgment in the question, I think what they're referring to probably is self-righteous hypocritical criticism, right? And that's always wrong. Like Jesus talks about that in Matthew 7. He says, "Do not judge lest you be judged, for in the way that you judge you will be judged, and by your standard of measure it will be measured to you. And why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So Jesus is what Jesus, I think, is attacking here is this self-righteous, hypocritical criticism. Always finding fault with others to make yourself feel better about yourself. And it's self-righteous in the sense that I'm not confessing my sin. I'm not dealing with my sin. The log is wagging around in my life, but I'm noticing this speck of sawdust in my neighbor's eye, and I'm fixated on that. You have a real problem, and I think we tend to do that because if we can fixate on somebody else's problem, we can feel better about our own problem. We can ignore our own problem, and sadly that happens a lot in Christian circles. It happens with everybody, but Christians are very guilty of this as too. And so we kind of punt back into this. Okay, well, we can't ever say anything about anybody's choices, but that's really not realistic, and that's not how the world functions, and nobody really operates that way. I mean, the people who if we go back to the issue of sexuality, the people who we are, I think, rightly called on the carpet for our self-righteous, hypocritical criticism of people's choices, right? Because we can be really mean and hateful about homosexuality or transgenderism, making jokes and making fun, and I don't think any of that is helpful or good. But those people can do the same thing, right? It's the issue of you can't say anything, but I can condemn you and I can criticize you, and that's okay. But what I'm trying to say is both sides do this. When you disagree with somebody, you tend, when you are not capable of presenting calmly a rational argument that can be debated and discussed, when you become so identified with your particular argument that to lose your argument means to lose your identity, then, and that's for Christians or people on the other side of the sexual issue, you become very aggressive and you attack, and you don't listen, and it's no longer about trying to understand right and wrong, trying to listen and learn from one another. It's all about conquest. It's all about, you not only have to accept me, you have to celebrate me. And if you don't celebrate me, then, and if you don't join with me in that regard, then you're wrong. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's always wrong, I think, to be hypocritically critical of others as a way of making yourself feel better about your own sin. Like, we should always start with our own sin.
Mm-hmm.
And if you notice in this text, Jesus doesn't say, don't take the speck out of your brother's eye.
Mm.
He says, deal with your own problems first, and then you will be able to see clearly. And I think that's where we forget, because Jesus in other places, like in the same book at Matthew 18, when your brother sins against you, go to him privately and talk about it. So there is a legitimate place for having a conversation about sin, about right and wrong, about ethics and morality and things like that. There's a right place to do that. There's a right way to do that. But it begins with the humility that recognizes I'm a sinner. And I'm not saying this to make myself feel better. I'm saying this out of genuine concern for your well-being. And so if you're not speaking these truth with the intent of love, that I'm concerned for your well-being and I want to help you, you need to just be quiet. Mm-hmm. And as a Christian, we need to recognize when that's happening and move away from this hypocritical criticism of people, this mocking of people, this slandering of people. We don't listen to them. We put up straw men and argument, and so that we can knock it down and make ourselves look good. And all the while neglecting our own sin. We become like the Pharisees in the New Testament, where they were very critical of adulterers and tax collectors and people of the world, but inside their own hearts, Jesus spoke very clearly to these individuals. You neglect the weightier matters of the law. You have no love for others. You mistreat people. I hope that's clear what I'm trying to say there. I think the place that you've got to come to, it's not that you never speak truth into someone's life. You should speak truth into someone's life. The place to do that, though, is not on a social media platform, blaring your opinion for all to hear. The place to do that's in a real relationship with somebody, because you care about their well-being, right. And the motive behind it is to help them. Now, if they're not interested in listening to you, then we need to shut our mouths and move on. In this text in Matthew 7, he says, "Do not cast your pearls before swine." Do not. If someone's not listening, it's not the time. So back off and just be kind, be gracious to them. It's not a war in that sense. The objective is not to conquer. The objective is to help. And if you're speaking truth simply to take them down and prove you're right, you just need to be quiet.
Yeah, like I think about, I had some friends growing up who they would say things that were true, but super hurtful, like to people, and then their excuse was, "Well, it's true.
Yeah,
well, I'm not gonna be a liar. I mean, it's a true fact about that person.
The truth hurts." Yeah,
and so they justified themselves by saying that. But the question is, okay, if this is all true, it is okay to speak up about our beliefs. It is okay to go against the culture, just like the culture is going against our thinking. We all have different opinions and beliefs, and we're holding to different values, and it's okay to discuss those. If that's all true, then how do we do this without being abrasive? How do we speak the truth in love? We throw that around all the time. We'll speak the truth in love. But how do we actually do that? How do we actually do it in a loving way that's not abrasive? Because I see so many Christians online that are claiming that they're speaking the truth in love, but really they're just being extremely hateful and divisive and causing arguments and really causing people to callous their hearts against Christians. So how do we do that? How do we speak the truth in love?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I go back to it's not something you do on social media. Like, stop making stupid posts about the side of an argument that you disagree with. The world needs less keyboard warriors. Yes. The real difference will be made in real people's lives. So do you see someone in your life that you have a concern for. You're concerned for their well-being. You're concerned for their safety. You're concerned for their relationship with God. You're concerned that they might hurt themselves, that they might damage themselves in some way. You want what's best for them, and from that motive, you want to speak to them, and you go to them with humility. You go to them with kindness. You go to them with graciousness. Like when you look at this text in Ephesians 4, everybody quotes speaking the truth in love.
Mm-hmm.
It's immediately followed with, in verse 17, that you walk no longer as the Gentiles walk. You don't live your life like a pagan anymore. You've been transformed by the grace of God. So that changes yourself. So if you keep going down, if you look down in verse 22, he says, lay aside the old self, being conformed or corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness and truth. So we have speak the truth in love, and we do that as people who have been transformed by the grace of God. The old self and the old ways of living life and the old ways of reacting to things and the old ways of speaking, we're laying those down, and we're putting on the new self, which is aligned with Christ. It's like Christ. It's shining with the light of Christ. What's the very first thing that he begins to target as an application? It's our speech. Mm-hmm. He says in verse 25, the very next phrase, therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. So we have to tell the truth, right? For we are members of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. So there's a place for anger in a sense, but it very easily leads to sin, right? But when things happen that are unjust or wrong, it does produce a righteous indignation. Like, that's not right. That shouldn't happen. That's okay. But what we do from there is sin or not sin. He says, be angry, but don't sin in response to that anger. And by doing so, you give the devil an opportunity. But then look at verse 29. He says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has forgiven you. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love. So, speaking the truth in love means how you communicate must be loving, must be tender-hearted, must be compassionate, must be gracious, must be humble, must be kind. And if our speech or our typing is hurtful and painful and designed only to humiliate the opposite point of view, you need to stop. That's what's abrasive.
Yeah.
And people will say, well, the gospel is abrasive. That is a cop-out. The gospel can be offensive, right? If people do not want to turn from idols to the living God, they're going to be against it. But much of the time, I fear, people are repulsed not by the gospel, but by the people who supposedly are talking about the gospel. And we are dishonoring the gospel, and we're not even allowing people to hear the gospel because we have become so odious and so repulsive by our demeanor, by our malice and our anger and our bitterness and our slander. All of that undercuts the gospel. Christians are not to be that way. That's the kind of stuff that's part of the old self that we put aside. The new self, like Jesus, is loving, it's gracious, it's kind. And if you can't speak with that, then you shouldn't speak at all. Saying, I'm just telling it like it is, and the truth hurts, that's a cop-out. That is a cop-out, because the scripture never gives you license to say whatever you want, so long as it's not false. You have to speak with the intention to build up, not tear down.
Yeah, I've been reading a book called The 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age by Rosaria Butterfield. And if you know her story, it's a perfect example of how do Christians be less abrasive. Rosaria is a former feminist activist, former lesbian, and she was teaching at a secular university and was writing papers on feminism and all this stuff. And she wrote, or a local pastor had responded to one of her questions or something like that. I don't quite remember. So she responded to his response, and the pastor wanted to meet up and like, hey, let's talk about this. Let's discuss your ideas on this, and maybe I'll share mine as well. And so they did, and he wasn't he didn't go with the intention of proving her wrong.
Mm-hmm.
He went with the intention of building a relationship.
Yep.
And from that, she started coming to their house and having dinner several times a week, and they began to love each other, even at polar opposite ends of this political spectrum. And just over time, this relationship kept growing and growing, and the Lord was gracious and showed her the truth in the scriptures, and she credits where she's at now a lot to that local pastor who his family brought her in and was just loving and had her over for dinner all the time, even though she was
different.
Completely different from what their ethics and moral, the people that they would normally surround themselves with. So I think that would be if you haven't read that book, it's The 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. It discusses a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in this podcast, about the sexual revolution and all these things. And Rosaria does it. She does speak truth and love as someone who has experience with Christians who are abrasive. And all it took was one Christian who wasn't abrasive, who wasn't hateful and divisive. And that's how the gospel won her. Was through a faithful messenger of the gospel. And then there's a couple other books that come to my mind when discussing these things. If you want to understand more about how we got to where we are in our society, there's a book called Strange New World
by Carl Trueman. That's a great book.
Yeah, by Carl Trueman. And then there's another one called Our Secular Age, and there's like a huge version of it that's like 600 pages or something. I haven't read that one, but there's a smaller one that I would recommend you read, and it discusses how we've gotten where we are and how to interact with politics and the social arena in light of our beliefs, and how do we not necessarily back down from what we believe or be conformed to the world, but instead speak the truth in love and still hold fast to our beliefs.
Yeah, Jonathan Leeman has written another good book about how Christians should engage in the public square and understanding what's legitimate and what's illegitimate, and this kind of what we were talking about at the beginning. And I think it's called How the Nations Rage by Jonathan Leeman. It's a really good, helpful book. I think that the thing I would end with on this is, as Christians, we have a responsibility to tell the truth, but we have a responsibility to tell the truth in love, and that means how we tell it. And the priority has to be, I think, like you said earlier, Chris, in relationship. We have to. Our objective is not to rescue a culture. Our objective is to help people see Jesus, help people love Jesus, and the way we do that is by loving like Jesus. And we've got to stop trying to conquer. People are not the enemy. People are held captive by the enemy, but they are not the enemy. And we have to stop treating them like the enemy. And even if you say, well, that's what they're treating us that way. No, they might, but we have been redeemed. We've been changed, and the nature and the compassion and the kindness and the forgiveness and the mercy of Christ should be emanating from our lives. We should be noticeably different, and so I would just encourage you. Let's put down our keyboards and let's put down our phones and let's stop trying to slander and take down and get a laugh and be victorious in the culture war. Let's love people and build relationships with people and strive to help them see Jesus as we see Jesus.
Yeah. Something that just came to mind was when Jesus was choosing his disciples, he chose Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector.
Yeah.
And this would have been like extreme leftists and extreme right
Mhm.
wing coming together, sleeping under the same tent with one another. Like Simon the Zealot's job was to kill people, like Matthew
Right.
the tax collector. And Jesus doesn't speak to one or the other their beliefs or their opinions about this or that. The thing that he speaks against is this religious hypocrisy.
Mhm.
So I would really, really be careful with how you approach people who have a different opinion,
Mhm.
because it didn't seem to matter to Jesus about Simon the Zealot's opinion versus Matthew's
I mean,
opinion.
we don't know what Jesus talked about in 3
Sure.
years of private conversations. But I think because there's both of those people probably had to come away from
Mm-hmm.
some aspects of their belief system to follow Christ. They had to lay down things that were dear to them, and like all of us have to do. But the reality of it is our objective is to be like Jesus, to
Mhm.
follow Jesus, to know Jesus, to love Jesus, and to help others to see Jesus as well. And it takes relationships, it takes time, it takes patience, it takes being willing to be wronged.
Yeah, and this podcast is all about, okay, how do we do this?
Mhm.
And I think one way that I would challenge you, you listeners, to put this into practice is, like Phil said earlier, put down the keyboard, and I would challenge you to invite people over
Mhm.
to your house for dinner. Show hospitality. Bring them in, love them. Guide your family into loving people who are vastly different than you.
Have a conversation with somebody you disagree with,
Mhm.
whether it's politically, religiously, something like that. But instead of going into that trying to convince them, go into that being willing to listen and learn why they think like they think, and allow them to push on your thoughts, why you think the way you think.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that all truth is equally valid, because that's a nonsensical statement. There is truth and there is false. Truth is that which corresponds to reality, and false is that which doesn't correspond to reality. So the objective is to get to truth. And you say, well, I have the truth. I know the truth. Well, yes, but we also have a tendency to misunderstand things at times.
Mhm.
So, but at the same time, you're not going to win anyone to Jesus by taking them down and humiliating them. You're going to win them to Jesus by listening and learning why they think like they think, and helping them to see Jesus.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap this episode up. Like James says, be slow to speak.
Yes.
Hold your tongue. Be quick to listen.
Mm-hmm.
So listen to your opponents, or the ones who have different opinions than you do. And then when the opportunity arises, speak the truth in love. Tell them what you think and do it in a gracious and gentle way.
Yep.
Anything else you want to add, Phil?
I think that's good. Let's love like Jesus.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And until next week, keep following Jesus. Hey, thanks again for tuning in to The Following. We hope you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful. If you did find this episode helpful, go ahead and hit that follow button and share this episode with your friends and family. And if you want more resources like this, visit hopeformacon.com or click the link in the description. And thanks again for submitting your questions as we took a break from John this week. And join us again next week as we get back into the Gospel of John. And thanks for listening. And until next week, keep following Jesus.